All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for joining us today for this webinar, Supporting Teachers and Young Learners as They Return to Classrooms, Interactions at the Heart of Healing. I'm super excited about today's topic. We've got some phenomenal presenters here, some very special guests. My name is Winston. I'm the Senior Marketing Director at Teachstone, and I'm joined today by Bridget Hamre, who is our CEO and co-founder, and Lawonda Roman, who is a senior class specialist. Bridget and Lawonda, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you. Thanks, it's great to be here.
Excellent. So I thought we'd start off, and actually before I get into the About Teachstone section, I want to go over a couple of housekeeping items. Couple things. We will be sending out a recording of the webinar and the slides from today's session in an email after the webinar. We will also be sending out a certificate of attendance, which you'll receive automatically from GoToWebinar in 24 hours. So sometime around probably 2 o'clock tomorrow, you can look for that email from GoToWebinar with your certificate of attendance. I'll also be sharing out some links through the chat panel. So throughout the webinar, we'll have some links that we'll share. And if you have any questions or comments, please submit them in the questions panel. All of our presenters can see the questions you're submitting. We'll do our best to pause throughout the webinar and answer those questions. And we really want to make this an interactive session. So with that, I want to just say thanks for being here, and we look forward to the conversation. So a little bit about Teachstone for those who are not familiar. We're an education company. We're located in Charlottesville, Virginia, and really our charge is focusing and ensuring that all students have access to life-changing teachers. We work with educators across the country and around the world, and we are the publishers of Class. And I want to take a quick poll and understand how familiar you all are with Class. So I'm going to launch a poll, and we'll give about 30 seconds to a minute to collect responses. But if you could, just submit this poll, and we'll get a read on how familiar you are with Class. All right, great. So looks like we've got about a third of the votes in. If you could submit that poll, and then we'll wrap this up in just a second. Okay, so go ahead and share the results, and it looks like we've got a good mix. So some folks don't know a whole lot about Class, some familiarity with Class, but don't use it. And some use Class to collect assessment data, and others use Class for assessment and professional development. So a good mix of folks. And if you are new to Class or not super familiar, don't worry. The concepts we're going to share today apply, I think, across any educator could benefit from it. You don't have to be familiar with Class, so but good to have a read on who's here. So what is Class? Class, the Classroom Assessment Scoring System, or Class, is a leading system for measuring and improving teaching quality. And really what Class looks at are the interactions between teachers and children. And we have a friend of ours, Dominic McCain, who I think does a much better job of describing this than any of us typically do. So I'm going to play a quick video, and I would ask if you are having issues with the audio of the video, please let us know. We think that this will work, but if it doesn't, then we will adjust. So I'm going to go ahead and play this video. Oops, hold on one sec.
I describe Class as the how of an educator's job. So often, educators are told the what of their job through a variety of evaluations, a variety of observations, but very seldomly does anyone get granular enough to help them understand immediate action they can take to transform what's happening in their classroom. Class does that. From the domains down to the dimensions, down to the indicators, down to the behavioral markers. It teaches and gives a very clear path for educators of how to do their job. So to me, class is the how of an educator's job.
Yeah, so I love that video. I think that that's a great description of what class is. So before we get into the content in the webinar, I wanted to ask a couple of quick questions. So number one is in the questions panel, let us know where you're from. We're curious to know who is joining us and where you're from. Wow,
See
so it looks
people
like
from Virginia, New York, Arizona, all over the country. California, my home state.
yeah, it looks like we've got a wide variety of folks here: California, Delaware, Los Angeles, Nebraska, Phoenix, Arizona, Minnesota, New York, Kentucky, Wisconsin,
Puerto Rico.
Yeah, Philippines, Brooklyn, New York, Nebraska. Excellent. Wow. It's always amazing when we host these webinars to see just the wide variety of attendees, and it's super exciting to have folks from all across the country and the world. China is here.
China. And Portugal, I saw. We really appreciate, especially on this. I know we're leading into a long weekend, so people making time to join us today is great.
Yep, absolutely. Okay. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. On a scale of 1 to 5, how are you doing today? So I'm actually going to run this as a poll. So 1 being I'm really not doing so hot, 5 being doing really, really well. Let's just do a quick pulse on how everyone's doing. And I'll say, just as we give a minute to submit this poll, it's been really interesting. We've run these webinars over the past few months with some regularity, and just to see the shift in responses, I think over the last few months, and happy to report kind of a positive trend in how people are feeling, and we'll see if that holds true today.
Watching the results come in, it's seeming like we're veering towards people feeling pretty good. Although I think any time in these COVID days, the range of response is absolutely expected. As Winston's closing this out, I don't know about any of you, but I have stopped asking people as I link to them on meetings, how are you more generally, because it's such a hard question to ask, but I like this. How are you doing today? Seems like a more manageable question these days.
Right, exactly. So here are the results. You know, not surprisingly, I think they're a little bit mixed. I think it's nice to see some people are doing really, really well, and at that 5 and 4 mark, and the majority of folks are there. Certainly a trying, challenging, bizarre time right now, but glad to see that folks are doing well. So thank you for filling out that poll. It's always interesting to see. Okay, moving on. In the questions panel, let us know, what are you most concerned about as children come back to school? And as we receive these inputs, we'll share out some of the results. And I think it'll be a good foundation for the conversation today. And somebody on the last poll commented in the question, said, I'm excited to be here. I'm alive.
It has brought us back to the basics these days. I see lots of concerns about health, safety, how the wearing of masks spread of the virus, children's social emotional concerns.
Yep. Social distancing.
Getting
Social
sick, I think it's, yeah, and just, you know, as educators, I know we both are concerned for our students, but also for our own health and the health of our families. I know is top of mind for many people.
Yep. Trauma, teacher mental health, having a sense of normalcy. Man, wouldn't that be nice? Lack of physical touch, that's a challenge. Children wearing masks, worried about wearing masks, safety.
Social distancing with preschoolers.
Yeah.
What is that going to look like?
Yeah, for those of you familiar with class, know that we are hard at work on some really specific guidance around how to collect class data and conduct these observations in the face of all these social distancing measures. So we're not going to talk a lot about that today, but there will be more coming from us over the summer, both in sort of written and probably a series of webinars. So we know those of you who use class have lots of questions about how to do those observations right now.
Absolutely. Okay, we're going to move on. Yep.
Great.
Okay, so Bridget, I'll hand over to you if you want to go through the objective of today's webinar.
Yeah. So I think as reflected in the comments and just the conversation, I think amongst all educators and parents right now, there's lots of concern about the level of trauma that children are experiencing in their homes, in their lives, due both to COVID, but also the sort of long-term systematic kinds of trauma that we know many of our young children experience day to day. But also to highlight the ways in which the everyday interactions that teachers have with children are foundational to supporting these children. Oftentimes when we talk about class, sometimes we talk about the average child's experience, but today we're really going to focus, you know, we know there is no average child. We really want to talk about the every child, and specifically about how you can use your interactions to support those children who are most in need of your support and care as they come back into the classroom. We'll be talking a little bit throughout the conversation today about the upcoming series that we have. So this is the launch of a series of webinars that will be available. So we'll give you more information about that. I'm so excited about the experts who we have coming to help us inform us and the world about this important topic. And please do ask the questions that you have, and we'll be trying to monitor and get back to those. All right, next slide, Winston.
Okay, so we'll do one more quick poll, and this is the last of these, I promise. But just so we have a good idea of who is here today, let's just launch a quick poll and tell us a little bit about yourself. What is your role?
And maybe as you're filling this out, we can share a little bit. So although I did co-found the company and was an academic for a long time, I also was a teacher. I was a coach. I was a coach of coach, and I was also a clinical psychologist. So I know I bring that sort of perspective to my work generally, but specifically supporting trauma. Lawonda, I wonder if you, as people are filling this out, just want to share a little bit about some of the experiences you've had in early childhood and education more generally. Lawonda, are you there? We can't hear you. All right, Lawonda may be having audio, but I can tell you that Lawonda was a teacher, has worked in the Dallas school system for a long time, a coach of coach, and we're just incredibly privileged to have her. She's been with the company for quite a while now and does lots of training, supportive coaching, and is just a phenomenal overall human who lives and breathes the kinds of interactions that we'll be talking about today. So excited to get to hear from her.
Sorry, I'm here now. For some reason, my computer is acting weird with unmuting me. But yes, thank you, Bridget, for introducing me. Yes, I have been with the company for some time now, and I have been in early childhood a little over 20 plus years. I've been as an educator, primarily working with pre-K and kindergarten teacher, taught kindergarten for over 11 years, and also worked as a coach and a supervisor of coaches. So definitely have a lot of experience and stories to bring when it comes to talking about this topic.
Great, and I see we have almost half the folks on our teachers, which is great. We're gonna spend, this is not gonna be an academic presentation, we're gonna spend a lot of our time just talking about the sort of practical experience of being in the classroom with kids and supporting children. So excited to see everyone here.
Definitely.
All right, Winston, you wanna kick us off?
Yep. All right. So moving right along. We're going to start this webinar in this section with setting the context. What is trauma and why is it harmful to children?
Yeah, and we'll do this section pretty quickly. You can go to the next slide. I imagine many of you are already familiar with sort of definitions of trauma, and certainly I know there's been a lot of information out of it as late, so we're really not going to spend a ton of time on that part today. But I did just want to sort of ground us. I like this definition of trauma from SAMHSA because it refers to the fact that trauma is not just about a specific event, but it's about an event or a series of events. But most importantly, it's not so much the event itself, but how it's experienced and the kind of lasting effects. So they talk about these 3 E's of event, experience, and effects. And I think it's important for us to remember that the same event might be experienced and sort of impact different children in different ways. So I really appreciate this definition. But many of the words we hear, toxic stress, adverse childhood experience, are really all focused on this idea of the ways in which our children are experiencing trauma and the impacts that they're then bringing into the classroom as you see them. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. We know that there are many different kinds of trauma that children experience. Winston, you could go to the next slide. So this is not an exhaustive list, but we also know that that the recent events of COVID are really just one more factor that has been influencing the lives of many of our children because many of these things sort of run together. So poverty in and of itself is one of the core causes of trauma, but also co-occurs with things, the other things on this list. And I think, you know, of great attention of late, but obviously nothing new, are the ways in which interpersonal and institutional racism are causing trauma. And we're going to talk a little explicitly about issues of racism, diversity, and equity in the classroom today. Go ahead in the next slide. So as we think about some of the causes of trauma, we also need to know that this is not a unique experience of a few, but it's something that is impacting many of our children. And with COVID, we know those numbers are going to be much, much higher. We also know that it's inequitably distributed. And the impacts, if you go to the next slide, Winston, the impacts of this trauma are really at a physiological level for children. And it's something that you'll hear a lot about in other elements of our webinar series here from some of the experts who really know and understand these physiological effects. But it is just important to remember that as children are feeling stressed, both in the moment of trauma, but also as they sort of re-experience that in the classroom, it's truly impacting their brains, their stress hormones in ways that change their behavior. And so what we see on the outside are these external behaviors, but we have to remember that often the behaviors aren't matching what children are feeling. And that's a big part of what we'll be talking about today and focusing on in this webinar series. And importantly, most importantly, what you can do about it. So if you go to the next slide, before we sort of dive in, I wanted to talk, Lawonda, I know this is, you know, there's a lot of statistics here, but I know this is something that really you have a very personal connection to. So I wondered if you just share a little bit about how you personally connect to this topic.
Yes, definitely, Bridget. Definitely what hits home is when you talk about the behavior are only a part of what children are experiencing. I just recall coming up how my mother was born with polio, and so by the time she had my sister, and I have an identical twin sister, she had undergone 10 surgeries to try to correct her her illness. But you know, all of those surgeries made her turn to drugs, right? And so the drugs that she used to numb her pain just pretty much made her get lost in the fact that she had 2 beautiful children that she had to take care of. And with that, my sister and I would, you know, by the time we became school-age children, would, you know, more so be taking care of her as opposed to her taking care of us. So us going to school, you know, having seen her use drugs, having to, you know, be out wee hours of the morning while she was, you know, in the house partying, wasn't allowed to go inside, and just sheer exhaustion. We would go to school and just be angry and upset, and teachers pretty much labeled us as behavioral children. Not once did anyone take the time to really ask us about our home life.
Do you remember, Lawonda, if you put yourself back in that moment, sort of what was the feeling in those moments of sort of being called out and shamed by teachers in the classroom?
Angry, rage, really wanting to fight all the time, and we did fight all the time. And as I was coming up through school, they still had corporal punishment, so we would be sent to the office and paddled for our outbursts and us fighting other children and hitting the teacher back and things of that nature. But again, that only enraged us even more. So like you stated, addressing the behavior itself, not actually getting to the root of the problem, wasn't what was happening for my sister and I.
Yeah. So we often talk, though, about how these sort of traumatic experiences aren't destiny, right? And you have had an incredibly successful career, a wonderful family. So can you, and I know there's many factors that have played into that, but I think it's an important piece for us to remember, because sometimes we can think and sort of label traumatized kids as there's nothing we can do to help them. So what sort of resonates with you about the experiences that you had that helped you lead, end up in such a successful place in your life?
I often say that not one educator, impacted me in that way. My grandmother actually she wasn't an educator, but she was one of those individuals that actually gained full custody of my sister and I by the time we reached 8th grade. And by the time she had done so, again, we were full of so much rage and anger that it took a lot of love, a lot of structure, a lot of behavior expectations set for us to really become successful in school. And even though she tried to shield us from some of the things my mom was doing, again, she was able to shield us at times, but at other times she was unsuccessful in doing so. And just her love and guidance and setting those expectations, ensuring that we studied, ensuring that we didn't act up in school anymore, and that there were going to be consequences for those behaviors. Done so out of love, of course, but making sure that ground rules were set in order for us to be successful. And then, of course, that translated back into our school environment, because we knew that we couldn't go to school and act up as we had done before, because there were consequences to our actions. So teachers didn't have the behavioral issues out of us that they once had.
I love that answer, because I think it just points to, we have this slide up about interactions at the heart of healing. And at the core, this isn't about class. Class is a measure of interactions, but it really is about decades of research and what we just know in our hearts, which is ultimately, it's all about relationships and interactions, and how important it is for children to find those adults, whether they be in their extended family or in the school setting, that can help them know that they are cared about, and give them a sort of path to success. So, in fact, I also love, if you go to the next slide, Winston, we could talk about many sort of practices, but given the short time that we have today, oops, I think we went backwards. We're going to focus on sort of 3 broad areas. The first is relationships, and I've sort of put in parentheses for our class gurus out there, the class dimensions. We're not going to focus on them today, but you'll hear us, just because Lawonda and I sort of naturally talk the language of class. You'll hear us sort of mention those kinds of things as we talk today, but we'll talk a little bit about relationships, about responsiveness, and about routines. And I heard you mention all of those things in your story about your grandmother. Mm-hmm. Just one, if you go to the next slide, I'm not going to focus a lot on research, but one of my favorite studies using the class was conducted by a former postdoc of mine, Bridget Hamre, a number of years ago now. But what I love about this study, I often refer to it as the spit study, because it actually was a study of children's cortisol, which they gather through taking spit samples from children. And as many of us know, cortisol is sort of a marker of stress. And we typically have higher levels of cortisol at the beginning of the day, and then those sort of level off. But what we know is actually most children in childcare, not even those who are experiencing trauma, but most children actually show increasing levels of cortisol. So being in childcare is actually stressful for most children, which is not surprising. You're in a new environment around many more children. And actually, we know that children who face trauma, these levels of stress are higher. But we see that when children are in classrooms with higher levels of emotional support as measured by class, they don't show this pattern of cortisol. So the fact that interactions really impact children at a physiological level that we can sort of capture in their spit is always remarkable to me. So it just shows the power of relationships to change children's physiology in ways that are really consequential. So if you go to the next slide, as we talk about relationships, responsiveness and routine, we're also going to draw attention to thinking about, again, this idea that it's not about every child, or it's not about the average child, but it's about every child. And how can we make sure that we're giving all children equitable access to these interactions in our classrooms? Because we know sometimes the children who need us most are not the ones who we're naturally drawn to want to spend time with. And we also want to pay attention to educators' own resilience and emotional well-being. And we saw a variability of how people were feeling now. And I know as you all walk back into that classroom, the levels of stress and anxiety are going to be high for you as well. And being thoughtful about how you can take care of yourselves is just a critically important part of being a great teacher, and one that's going to be harder to do in the coming months than it is even normally. So if we go to the next slide, I actually thought, rather than going through a bunch of slides, I know, Lawonda, you have so many experiences here. So I'm wondering if you can just think about one particular student that sort of stays in your mind from back when you were in the classroom who had experienced trauma. Maybe just tell us a little bit about that child and his experience.
Sure, definitely. One student that stands out is I was in my 3rd year of teaching, and this one particular student arrived late in the school year. He could barely use his words. This is a kindergarten classroom. He came from no structure. He arrived dirty. He came to school dirty every day. And I was one of those teachers who always kept clothes that my son had outgrew, and so that children can have an extra set of clothes to change in. Well, this student, by the 2nd, 3rd week that he was there, started to he started to poo himself. And it was one of those things where you start to smell something, but you're unsure of what the scent is. And the children called it to my attention. I immediately, first instinct was to yell at the student, asking him why he didn't go to the restroom. And he would just look at me and smile. And, I was just like, I don't understand. Why didn't you go to the restroom? He wouldn't say anything. So I made him go to the restroom, gave him some wipes, made him change himself, clean himself up. But the next day, it happened again, and I became extremely irritated. And so how you talk about making sure those, the kids who give you the most behavioral issues, those are the ones that need the most care. Well, that thought was not in my mind at that time, because here it was, this child was doing it again. And I decided that I was going to let his mother have it about this and just let her know that this was unacceptable. He was school age. He needed to, learn how to go to the restroom. Well, the mother never came that evening. Well, she came, but she never came she didn't come at dismissal. And this particular day was a tutoring day, so it wasn't abnormal for me to stay at work late. Tutoring was over at 4:30, mother still wasn't there, but by the time 6 o'clock came, I was too tired to rant at her. I just told her what was going on, and the mother proceeded to yell at the child. Well, that evening I went home, told my husband what was going on. He's a Dallas police officer, and he explained to me that he was like, Lawonda, something could be going on. I see too many cases where children are being molested, and this is one of the signs. So my heart broke. Came back the next day, this child had on a pull-up. He proceeded to poo himself again that day, but this day I decided to send him to the nurse to have them to change the pull-up to see what was going on. So the nurse actually changed him and found that this child had been bleeding from his rectum. We reported it, of course, but I was devastated at the fact that I did not pay attention to the cues, that I was so focused on the fact that this child was doing this in the classroom and that he was of school age, and that it shouldn't be taking place. Well, they removed the child from the home, but later the mother got him back and he returned to the classroom about a month or so later. And I vowed then that I would give this child all the love and attention and structure that he needed, to be successful. And just thinking back on my own experience, I had to tell myself, and remind myself, how would you want someone to treat you and your child, right? And so in thinking about that, I made sure that when this child acted out, played inappropriately with the children, and/or fought against, not wanting to come to school, that I was there to greet him, provide him with that structure that he needed. Not that he was going to be a model child because he was so far behind, but I made sure that when he left me, he was a better student, a better person, because I tried to teach him how to process the things he was going through, which is so important.
It's, one of the things I wonder about as you're talking is how easy it was to form a relationship with him, because we know that often for children who don't have experiences that that give them the message that adults can be helpers, that adults will care for them, our attempts to form connection are often met with actually more oppositional behavior. So that, I'm curious if that happened in this case, or if you've sort of experienced that with others. It's just once we get through the hard work of saying, oh wait, I need to lean into my relationship, sometimes the students make that hard. I don't know if that was true with him.
Yes, definitely. He fought against it because, again, I think for him, the only thing he saw was me getting, or remember, was me getting so upset with him in the beginning for the things that happened. And so I had to, when the children would be in whole group, he would come sit next to me, or I'd put my arm around him. I would, always made sure that I spoke in a warm voice that was very loving and provided him that one-on-one support that he needed to ensure that when he saw the other kids reading or engaging in academic activities that he could not yet do, he saw that I was there providing that individual support. Not that he was able to do it just yet, but that he was making those attempts and I was celebrating every attempt that he made.
And it's so, I think it's so hard. I remember talking a lot when I was coaching to teachers about this, that it's so hard not to take personally sometimes when the students push back, right? So I'm offering you my care and then you're acting out and you don't want it. And it's so easy to personalize those moments. Again, I don't know if you had that experience with him, but sort of what are the messages you tell yourself when you've sort of made the flip? I'm gonna fix this relationship. But it's not working. How do you sort of gather the strength and motivation to keep focused?
I have to remind myself, and period, in life, with working with anyone, that it's not about me. The things that people are saying or doing, what things that children are doing is not about me. It's something that is about this child that I need to ensure that I reach. So not take it personal. When children act out and they want to hit you, it's not personal. It's just their way of acting out. And I had to remind myself that this is not personal. It's not an attack on me. It's not an attack on my character. It's not an attack on my teaching style. It's just a way of this child asking for help.
Yeah. Well, and I know, we're not going to talk a lot about it today, but as we do work to support teachers, one of our sort of go-tos is the use of video. I always say that seeing teaching transforms teaching. And I think this is a good example where sometimes when we're in the moment, it becomes very hard to sort of be reflective, but the opportunity to sort of watch yourself interact with children, especially children with whom you're struggling, I think sometimes can be so powerful because you just see things in a new light. I don't know if you ever had the opportunity while you were teaching, Lawonda, to use video, but I know you've certainly had that experience a lot as a coach and working at Teachstone.
Yes. My last couple of years in the classroom, when class was rolled out in Dallas ISD, I had to record myself just for the coaching purposes, but definitely was able to see how those little snippets of you kind of not really snapping, but using a tone that's inappropriate at times because you're so on edge. Teaching is such an emotional and mentally draining profession that, sometimes you don't realize the toll that it's taking until one little thing just tends to bubble over and you snap or you say something that in a tone that you shouldn't say it in. So definitely being able to see yourself do those things helps you become more reflective of your teaching practices.
Yeah. So actually, if we go to the next slide, we're going to spend just a few minutes. It's something we do all the time. Those of you who've done professional development with us know that we spend lots of times watching video, and we'll hope this works. It was working earlier, although the video was going a little slowly, so we'll work. But what we're planning to do is sort of watch this video and pause a few times and just talk about what this teacher's doing to support this child who's entering the classroom after a really stressful and traumatic weekend. So Winston, if you want to sort of cue it up.
Yep, sure.
We'll
Just
see if it gets started. It's interesting. It looks like it's not at the very beginning right now, but we'll see where it starts when you hit play.
Come on. I'll see you soon. Long, rough weekend, I know. It's fine waiting for you back. You don't seem happy today. Do you see your name over here somewhere? And then I'll read you a story. Would I make you feel better if I read you a story a little bit? I know. I want my mommy too.
All right, so it's a little choppy, at least on my end, but we've, Lawonda and I have seen this video many times. Some of you may have seen it as well. So just to set the stage, this is a child who's sort of entering the classroom feeling really sad, missing her mom. And I do want to say, when we're supporting children with trauma, sometimes they display their emotions and make their need for us very clear, like this child and her crying. And sometimes it's much more subtle. So I just wanted to comment on that because this is one of those sort of very obvious times when we would feel sort of drawn in to support her. But Lawonda, what just in this very first clip, what did you see the teacher doing that was helping support this child as she walked into the classroom?
You can clearly see that this teacher was acknowledging the child's emotions by just saying, you had a really rough weekend, you don't seem happy. She, then proceeds to offer different ways to comfort this child by asking her, would it make you feel better if I read you a story? And in that moment, you can clearly see how this teacher's calm voice and that physical affection that she was giving her by placing her arm around her starts to calm this child, which really demonstrates, like you stated, that importance of those relationships that we develop. Children have to know that we are their alternate secure base. And this teacher definitely demonstrated that in this first few seconds of this video.
Yeah, and the other thing I noticed, and you sort of alluded to this, is just the acceptance of the emotion, right? So when we as adults feel challenging emotions ourselves, or children come in very angry, very sad, I'll just speak for myself. I know that sometimes my inclination is to like, how can I make everybody happy again? And you can so see how in this moment, what the child needed was to be met and not to be made to feel better until she was ready to really authentically feel better, but to be joined in her sadness and her emotion. You even heard the teacher saying, I totally get it. Sometimes I miss my mom too. That joining and sort of acceptance of emotion seems really important.
Definitely, totally agree.
We'll watch just a little bit more if we can get the video to play again.
Yep, give me 1 second. I'll make sure this is queued up in the right spot.
Come on.
Let me see if I can skip forward.
Yeah, you can skip forward to wherever, Winston. We're pretty flexible.
I'll see you soon.
All right, actually, why don't we go ahead and we won't watch more, but I think, so if you want to just stop it.
Draw me a picture, let me know how much you miss her. Okay, let's try your name. There we go. Great, and then we'll draw my picture and let her know how much you miss her because mommy's coming back right after lunch.
So Winston, you could go ahead and stop it. One of the things that we actually haven't talked a lot about so far is the importance of routines. We've been talking a lot about sort of relationships and responsiveness, but Lawonda, I'm curious, when you think about routines, the behavior management, like the productivity, some of those things might not come immediately to mind as being important when we're talking about trauma, but why are those important and what do you see here related to that?
Well, I think that when we're thinking about the routines, those routines are important, especially for children with traumatic experiences, because sometimes that structure that we provide is the only structure that they receive. And so knowing that when they come into the classroom, they know what to expect. They know that, Ms. Roman is going to be there to greet them at the door. When they come in, they're going to sit down and, have their breakfast, and we're going to go to circle time. Those routines that we place for our children really provides that level of security that is important for them to have.
Yeah,
Definitely.
absolutely, yeah. And making the time and space to be able to be available to individual children when you need them. If you have a set of clear routines in the classroom, it becomes so much easier to do that. We really see that happening here. So Winston, why don't we go back to the main sort of slide deck, and we're just going to talk a little bit as we end about equitable interactions in the classroom. So if you go to the next slide, many of you are probably familiar with some of these data, but as we talk about some of the inequities specifically related to race in the United States, we have these sort of very sobering statistics, like Black students are nearly 4 times as likely to be suspended as white students, and we know that that happens very early. So these data that came out a number of years ago now showing that Black preschoolers are almost 4 times as likely to receive 1 or more out-of-school suspensions. Just truly appalling observations about the ways in which our Black and brown children are being sort of systematically kicked out of the classrooms right at the moment when they really need our support and care. And if you go to the next slide, some of you may have seen this research, but I find it to be some of the most compelling research. It was conducted by Walter Gilliam, who actually also conducted the study on pre-K expulsion. But what they did here is they actually had a video, and you see it here, of a set of children playing with Play-Doh, and they asked teachers to just hit a button every time they saw one of the specific children demonstrating challenging behavior. The trick was, as there often is in research, there actually was no challenging behavior in that video. But when asked which children sort of required the most attention for their behavioral problem, 42% of the teachers identified the Black boy. And that was equally prevalent amongst both Black and white teachers. Interestingly, another part of this study is that the teachers, when watching the video, were wearing these like crazy fancy eye tracker glasses that allow us to sort of pay attention to where in the video they're looking at. And what they saw in this study is that teachers, again, of all races, were more likely to be watching the Black children, and especially the Black boy. And why I think this is important is because so we know from this research and much other research is this is a sort of incipient way that racism impacts our youngest children, right? It's not just about systematic racism, that's absolutely there, but it's actually at the level of interactions. And many of us have been sort of trained to assume that Black children are more likely to be behavior problems. And this is just one piece of evidence about that. And I think it's really an important reminder to us to be very, very thoughtful. I would again sort of emphasize how powerful video can be as an opportunity to help teachers be self-reflective about their own practices. Whether you're sort of scoring on the class, or we often have folks watching video and just keeping track of how often they're asking questions or sort of making reprimands of all the children in the classroom, and being able to look at the data to see if that's equitably distributed. Lawonda, as you hear about this research, do you have any thoughts or reflections?
Yeah, I do actually, and thinking about the study, and just understanding that when we're thinking about our Black students, understanding that the experiences are going to totally differ sometimes from other races, and so making sure that as we're viewing the traumatic or trauma-informed care, thinking about how we can better address that through an equitable lens, right? Like you stated, making sure that we're addressing the issue that they're experiencing and not the color, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And as Winston sort of previews the rest of our trauma series, we're really lucky to have Dr. Yamaruka, who has done some of the foundational research in this space and published a wonderful book with some of her colleagues on this, who will be talking and sharing more of her insights and ideas about this really important topic. So then to end, before we give you a little bit more background about what we have coming up in future webinars. If you go to the next slide, Winston, we do just want to end in this moment of remembering to take care of yourselves. And I know that's easier to say than it is to do. All of us are incredibly busy, and we're often, I think, as educators told that we're supposed to just be thinking about the kids and not taking care of ourselves. But I'm always reminded of that piece of advice I think I got as a new parent, which was, think about it as being in that airplane. And if the air masks come down, you have to put the mask on yourself first and then put it on the children, because if you're not taking care of yourself, you're not going to be able to be there for the children in your care. Lawonda, any sort of advice to your fellow educators and teachers about things they can do to help take care of themselves during these challenging times?
Take some time to breathe, walk away, because if you're in the moment, especially with a very traumatized child that continues to have outbursts, it's not easy. So take some time to breathe and walk away. Lean on your colleagues. If you have to lean on your colleagues and just, have a venting session so that you're able to go back in and give them your full selves, then that's what you need to do. And then, like you stated here on the slide, making sure that you are doing something to de-stress yourselves, such as exercising, making sure that you exercise so that you're not coming in stressed or, having to have all of that, that negative energy balled up, that you have a way to release it is going to be important.
That emotional regulation, sort of stopping yourself in that moment, sort of before you do the thing that you're not supposed to do, is one of the hardest. I think I was sharing with Lawonda the other day. I'm a mom of a 13-year-old and 6-year-old twins, and I did this weekend have one of those moments when I found myself sort of yelling at one of my 6-year-olds. So that is just to say, also one of the great pieces of advice I got is that the very best parents do the wrong thing 51% of the time. So not expecting perfection, but just being realistic and at this time of unknowns, I think having a group of colleagues around to support will be really important.
Bridget, just so that I can add one more thing. Children aren't looking for us to be perfect, right? They're not looking for us to demonstrate a level of perfection. They're just wanting us to love on them. And once we provide that love and attention, then we can start to address their academic needs. So making sure that we understand that, once we take care of ourselves, then impart that love and care on them.
Great. I actually do love, and we won't talk about it very much today, but I do love your sort of mention of the academics. I think at this time when even we are focusing a lot on emotional support and routines and classroom organization, it is important to remember that that doesn't mean to set instruction aside, and that our children who've been traumatized also need the kind of language supports and rigorous instruction and opportunities. And in fact, if we do those things, they'll be more engaged in ways that are also a support to them in the classroom. All right, so I'm going to turn it back over to Winston just to share a little bit more with some of the upcoming webinar series, and we'll get to hear from Matt Owens, our content director, who's really been the leading charge for us in that work. So Winston.
Yeah, thanks, Bridget and Lawonda. I've been going through the questions and trying to keep up with feedback, but so much great feedback and engagement, and thank you both so much for this wonderful discussion. I think it's been really valuable for the audience, and really appreciate it. Just to reiterate, the recording will be sent out. We'll send out the slides. We're also accessible if you have questions or feedback after the webinar. Just send us an email at interactions@teachstone.com, and we'll keep an eye on that email inbox. So we're going to skip ahead, and I wanted to just give a preview of some of the upcoming webinars. As Bridget mentioned earlier, this is the start of a webinar series. These webinars are free. We have started creating a trauma-informed course with several experts in the trauma-informed space. And as we were developing this course, we thought, wouldn't it be great if we could have these folks on a webinar series and have conversations with them for free, that we could invite our audience and others to come and join us and have these important discussions. And they're so timely right now as children are coming out of these traumatic experiences over the last several months and back into classroom settings. We want to make sure that educators are well prepared to respond appropriately. So next week, July the 8th at 2 p.m., we'll have Jimmy Venza and Amber Ricks to talk about the impact of trauma on behavior. The following week, we'll have Ioma Iruka, who Bridget mentioned earlier, who is an anti-bias, anti-racist education expert, talking about those topics. And then the 23rd, we're going to have Amanda Williford from the University of Virginia talking about cultivating connections and relationships and relationship equity in the classroom. And then on the 29th, we'll have Rachel Wagner from the Devereaux Center talking about promoting resilience and hope in times of trauma. We're super excited to have these great experts on this series. And I'm going to send in the chat a link where you can find more details about the full series and where to register. We'll also send this out in the email following this webinar so that you can share it with your staff or others, and we welcome anyone who can attend these. We're really, really excited to have these folks on. And I also mentioned the trauma-informed course that we're creating, and I wanted to have our Director of Content, Matt Owens, share a little bit about what this course is all about and why we created it. So this will be about a 5 or 6 minute video. There may be some lags in the audio, but just bear with us, and we'll hear from Matt a little bit about who these folks are on the series and why we went through the links we did to create this course.
Hey everyone, my name is Matt Owens. I'm the Director of Content and Online Learning here at Teachstone. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you today, but I'm very happy you joined Bridget and Lawonda today to get our trauma-informed PD series kicked off with this webinar series. I'm part of the team that's building the Interactions at the Heart of Healing Trauma-Informed PD online course. And there's lots of exciting things to come over the course of the next 4 weeks, including a webinar conversation with Ioma Iruka of HighScope, where we'll preview some of the content in the course that focuses on anti-racist, anti-biased educator practices. We will then talk to Amanda Williford about creating relational equity in your classroom, so assessing which students are most connected with you and finding opportunities intentionally to create attachment with those who you are less connected with for whatever reason, and strategies within that. And then finally talking to Rachel Wagner, in which we focus on, she's from the Devereaux Institute for Resilient Children, where we'll focus on 3 protective factors within children and how to cultivate those to buffer against the negative impacts of trauma and to prepare children for future instances of misfortune and change. But what I want to mostly talk to you about right now is what's coming next week, which is an incredible conversation with Teachstone's very own Sarah Haddon and the Laurie Center for Social and Emotional Wellness, Children's Social and Emotional Wellness, where we'll have Jimmy Venza and Amber Ricks, who I'm so excited for you to meet if you don't know them already. They will discuss, the 3 of them, how we can see children's behavior as communication. They do an incredible job at the Laurie Center of seeing educators as full humans, thinking about your emotional state and how that impacts the ways in which you participate in a relationship with children. They'll talk about team care and the importance of ensuring that your adult relationships are strong. And without further ado, what I thought I would share with you is just a clip from our interview. The full interview is going to be in the course, but I'm going to show you a little bit of Amber talking about what trauma does to children's basically cognition, and then how that then affects their behavior. And then fast forward maybe 10 minutes, it's just going to be a quick jump, and I will say something in response to Amber, which you won't hear, and then Jimmy will build on that in talking about what you can expect to feel as an educator and how to think about your emotional participation in a relationship with children who have experienced serious misfortune or change and who are bringing their traumatic experiences in their bodies into the classroom. So without further ado, thank you for coming. And meet Amber Ricks and Jimmy Venza.
When trauma happens, right, especially for children, verbal development is often the last step in a series of development. They develop physically, they develop emotionally, they develop in terms of comprehension, but in order to produce language, that's often the last step. And so when something traumatic happens, a lot of the brain resources are devoted just to survival. And they're diverted away from those verbal processing and those verbal abilities. So even if you have an 11-year-old who's normally really verbal and able to talk for days about a book that they read or a play that they saw, when it comes to a traumatic experience where their brain really was focusing on keeping themselves safe, they might lose those language abilities. And so recognizing that for even the most verbal among us, when trauma happens, it's likely going to be, like Jimmy said, encoded in your body in physical memories and not necessarily these organized narratives. And so that's always the goal and something that's really important to keep in mind with seeing kids who might have experienced trauma, because rather than saying this thing happened to me, they're going to be expressing through physical or interpersonal or relationship-based ways that something happened to them that was really hard and really scary and really disorganizing.
You're saying if you've previously experienced inadequacy as a thing that you feel when you interact with this child, you can expect you may feel it again. And the question is not how do you stop that feeling, but it's what do you do with it when it does arise. So like breathing is a wonderful example for me personally that I found, like, okay, I know I'm going to feel this. What do I do when I feel it? Rather than trying to just suppress and not pay attention to those feelings, which some of us adults are also somewhat skilled at. Yeah.
I guess you just highlighted such a good point. And the idea of actually you can despair or rage and know that that's the child's traumatic experience coming through the child to you, because you're sharing a relational experience. And that the best of teachers, the best of clinicians all have these feelings. And that's when you know you're tuning in. So it's actually, think of it as a contradiction. You feel great about not feeling great. But that's because you're connected to the student. But you don't, but this is where you have one foot with the student, the empathic part is there, but not fully there, because your other foot is going to be in the resiliency piece and help to pull the child and create the.
Great, yeah, and I want to just give a preview there of the upcoming sessions that we have. And I saw a little bit of feedback. It looks like the registration link that I shared out is having some issues, so we'll reshare that link here shortly after the webinar. We're right at 2 o'clock. Got just a couple more slides I wanted to share out. So we do have the trauma-informed care course that we have created and will be launched at the beginning of August. I'm going to go ahead and send out a link to that page on our website if you're interested in learning more. We would love to have you participate in that course. I think there's just some phenomenal content that's going to be included there. All of the speakers that we have in the webinar series are actually the experts who are contributing to this coursework. So go check that out. It's going to be available early August. There's an online course, and then there's also a transfer to practice webinar. So we could do, small session webinars with your organization only and share how to take these great practices that, or these great concepts that you've learned and put them into practice. So some exciting stuff there. And then lastly, we want to invite you all to Interact Now, our teacher summit. This is the first virtual teacher conference that we've run. It's going to be August 4th through the 5th. And we realize that it's a tough time to schedule a conference because some programs are going back earlier, some later. But the beauty of this conference is if you can't join in person, we'll have all of the sessions available on demand after the conference concludes. So some really great content there coming up at our Interact Now Virtual Teacher Summit. If any of you attended Interact in this spring, we actually did it all virtual, all online. And we had some phenomenal feedback. People really, really enjoyed it. There were so much so many great discussions and so many great presenters that we thought we want to do this again in the fall when we feel like teachers are going to need supports and really great content as they prepare to come back with all the uncertainty going on. Let's have some really great discussions around how we can best prepare to welcome children back in the appropriate ways. So with that, I think we're going to wrap up. I am going to leave one last poll on the screen just to ask if anybody is interested in learning more about Interact or our trauma-informed course. We'd be happy to talk to you more about that. So I'll put this poll up on the screen, and feel free to let us know if you would like to hear from somebody at Teachstone about these new solutions. And Bridget,
thanks. Yeah. I was just going to say, Winston, thank you. And just thank you to all of you for spending time with us today, but most importantly for doing the work that you do every day to support our young children. We're honored and humbled to be a little tiny part of that work. And I just really do feel honored to be able to have you join us today, and look forward to the continued conversation we have with our community about how we get through this challenging time together. So thanks a lot. And Lawonda, thank you so much for joining me, my great colleague, and sharing a very personal story that I think I feel deeply humbled as well to have you and your experience as a part of our organization.
Thank you so much, Bridget. It has been an honor being here and being able to share my story.
All right. Thanks, Winston.
All right, thank you both so much. And thank you everyone for attending. This has been a fantastic webinar. I think we've had some really great conversations, and thank you again to Bridget and Lawonda. We appreciate all of you and all that you do, and we will see you on the next webinar. I'll send out the link to register at the close of this session, and look forward to seeing you there. Thanks a lot.